Take a deep breath and let the modern world fade into the background. Imagine the ticking of a grandfather clock, steady and rhythmic, echoing through a hallway lined with heavy oak. Outside, the world is changing at a pace never seen before. But here, inside this space we are creating together, time slows down. We are stepping back into the 19th century, into the heart of the Victorian era. It is a time we think we know well from novels, films, and the stiff, unsmiling faces that stare out at us from old, silver-plated photographs. We have been taught to see this era in shades of grey and black, a world of repressed emotions, soot-stained brick, and a constant, heavy sense of mourning. But as we sit here in the quiet, let us begin to peel back that grey veil. Let us look closer at the colours, the sounds, and the hidden warmth of a world that was far more vibrant and human than history books often suggest. Close your eyes and picture a Victorian street. You likely see a thick, yellow fog and people dressed in nothing but dark, sombre tones. This is the first myth we must gently set aside. The Victorian world was, in reality, an explosion of colour. For centuries, dyes had been expensive and muted, derived from roots, crushed insects, or rare minerals. But in the middle of the century, a young chemist named William Perkin accidentally discovered the first synthetic dye while trying to find a cure for malaria. He called it morphine. Suddenly, a brilliant electric purple was available to everyone. It was followed by vibrant magentas, deep emerald greens, and shocking blues. The Victorians did not shy away from these colours. They embraced them with a passion that would make a modern minimalist recoil. Imagine stepping into a parlour where the wallpaper is a rich, swirling pattern of gold and turquoise. The curtains are a heavy crimson velvet, and the carpet is a garden of woven roses. They lived in a world of high contrast and saturation, a celebration of the new industrial power to bring beauty and brightness into the everyday home. As we move through this house of the past, we see those famous portraits on the mantel. Men with high collars and women with hair parted severely in the middle, all of them looking as though they had never known the joy of a shared joke. We have been told for generations that this was because they were a stiff and humourless people, or perhaps because their dental hygiene was so poor they dared not show their teeth. But the truth is much more practical and much more relatable. Think of the technology of the time. To capture an image, a subject had to sit perfectly still for several minutes, sometimes even longer in the early days of the daguerreotype. If you have ever tried to hold a wide, beaming smile for even 60 seconds, you know that the muscles in your face begin to twitch and ache. The smile becomes a grimace, a mask of strain. A neutral, relaxed expression was simply the most sustainable way to remain still. Furthermore, the Victorians viewed a photograph not as a snapshot of a moment, but as a formal representation of one's legacy. It was a successor to the painted portrait, a serious undertaking intended to capture the soul and the character, not a fleeting impulse. In their private lives, away from the freezing gaze of the camera lens, they were a people obsessed with puns, wordplay, and rowdy parlour games. They wrote letters filled with gossip and teasing, and they laughed at the same absurdities of life that we do today. The silence of the photograph is a technical limitation, not a reflection of the Victorian heart. Listen to the soft crackle of the fire in the grate. This heat was the centre of the Victorian home, a sanctuary built against the cold, fast-moving world outside. We often mock the clutter of the Victorian interior, the way every surface was covered with lace doilies, porcelain figurines, dried flowers under glass domes, and heavy drapes. To our modern eyes, it feels suffocating. But to them, this was the architecture of comfort. The world outside was becoming increasingly mechanical and impersonal. Factories were rising, trains were screaming across the countryside, and cities were growing into teeming, chaotic giants. In response, the Victorians turned their homes into soft, padded cocoons. Every object on a shelf was a memory, a piece of the natural world brought inside, or a shield against the noise of the street. They invented our modern concept of the home as an emotional retreat, a place where the soul could rest among familiar, tactile things. Consider the myth of the Victorian lady, trapped in a corset so tight she could barely breathe, fainting at the slightest provocation. While fashion could be extreme, for the vast majority of women, the corset was a functional garment, providing the same kind of support that a modern sports bra or a sturdy pair of work boots might offer. It was a foundation for the heavy skirts and multiple layers of fabric required for warmth and modesty. Women hiked mountains, worked in factories, and managed large households while wearing these garments. The stories of tight lacing, to the point of rib damage, were often the sensationalist clickbait of 19th century newspapers, or the complaints of male doctors who understood very little about women's daily lives. The fainting couch was less a necessity for a gasping woman, and more a piece of furniture for a society that valued the aesthetic of a peaceful, reclining rest. In the quiet of this evening, we can also begin to rethink how they saw time and life itself. We are often told that the Victorian era was a time of short lives and constant death, where the average life expectancy was in the low 40s. This statistic, while mathematically true, is deeply misleading. It was heavily skewed by a tragic rate of infant mortality. If a Victorian child survived the perils of early childhood, they could reasonably expect to live into their 60s, 70s, or even 80s, just as we do today. They were not a society of the young dying old. They were a society that understood the fragility of life, and, because of that, cherished the endurance of age. As we sit in this imagined parlor, surrounded by the scent of beeswax and the soft glow of oil lamps, we start to see the Victorians as they truly were, not as shadows in a dark alleyway, but as people navigating a world of massive change with a desire for beauty, a sense of humor, and a deep need for connection. They were the first generation to deal with the pressures of a globalized, industrial world, and many of the ways they sought comfort are the same ways we seek it now. They weren't different from us. They were simply us, dressed in more fabric, trying to find a quiet moment in a noisy century. The rain continues to beat a gentle rhythm against the window pane, and the shadows in the corner of the room dance softly. There is so much more to uncover beneath the surface of this era, so many more layers of misunderstanding to gently pull away. We have only just begun to look at the textures of their daily lives, the food they ate, the medicines they trusted, and the strange, beautiful ways they found to spend their leisure hours. Think about the way they traveled, not just across the oceans, but through the streets of their own towns. The horse-drawn carriage, the rhythmic clip-clop of hooves on cobblestones, was the heartbeat of the city. It wasn't the slow, romantic crawl we see in period dramas. It was fast, loud, and sometimes dangerous. The cities were sensory overloads of smell and sound, and yet, within that chaos, there were pockets of incredible stillness. Public parks were being designed for the first time. Green lungs for the city where the working man and the aristocrat could both walk among the trees and breathe air that was slightly cleaner, slightly fresher. This was the Victorian gift to the future. The idea that everyone, regardless of status, deserved a moment of peace in nature. As the lamp wick flickers, let your mind drift to the kitchens of the era. We imagine bland boiled meats and grey vegetables, but the Victorian spice cabinet was a global treasure chest. Because of the vast trade routes of the empire, the average middle-class kitchen had access to nutmeg, cinnamon, cloves, and ginger in abundance. They loved bold flavors, rich sauces, and elaborate jellies. Their food was an art form, a way to show hospitality and care. Even the simplest tea was a ritual of warmth and slowed down time. The more we look, the more we see that the Victorian era wasn't a static, frozen point in history. It was a bridge. It was the moment the ancient world met the modern world, and the friction between the two created a culture that was vibrant, contradictory, and deeply fascinating. It was a time of great explorers and quiet poets, of massive steamships and delicate lace. And as we continue to explore this world, we find that the facts we got wrong are often the most interesting parts of the story. They remind us that history isn't a collection of dates and dry statistics. It is a collection of human experiences, of people who felt the cold, loved the light, and sought, just as we do, a place of belonging in a changing world. The fire is burning low now, the embers glowing a soft, deep orange. The house is still, and the world of the 19th century feels a little closer, a little more real. We are no longer looking at ghosts. We are looking at neighbors across the span of time. There is a peace in knowing that despite the different clothes and the different technology, the human heart remains very much the same. We will continue this journey, moving deeper into the alleys and the grand halls, into the bedrooms and the workshops, finding the truth that has been hidden for over a century in the folds of a velvet curtain. The glow of the embers remains steady, casting long, soft shadows that stretch across the floorboards. In this stillness, we turn our attention from the visual world of the Victorians to the very bodies they inhabited. There is a common belief that the 19th century was a time of primitive medicine, a dark age of leeches, sores, and a total lack of hygiene. We imagine a person falling ill and being subjected to terrors that were worse than the disease itself. While it is true that this was an era before antibiotics and before we fully understood the invisible world of germs, the reality of Victorian health was a complex tapestry of innovation, deep compassion, and a surprising commitment to what we would now call wellness. To understand how a Victorian felt about their health, we have to move away from the image of the hospital and move back into the home. For most of the era, the hospital was a place of last resort, reserved for the destitute. If you were ill, you were cared for in your own bed, surrounded by the familiar sense of your own life. Healing was a domestic art. Mothers and grandmothers were the first line of defense, armed with handwritten recipe books that contained as many remedies for a cough as they did for a sponge cake. They used horehound for the throat, lavender for the nerves, and peppermint for the stomach. There was a profound belief in the healing power of nature, a gentle medicine that focused on supporting the body while it recovered. One of the most enduring myths is that the Victorians were constantly poisoned by their own environment. We hear stories of wallpaper laced with arsenic and bread whitened with chalk. While these dangers certainly existed in a world struggling to regulate new industrial processes, the Victorians were not passive victims. They were, in fact, the pioneers of the public health movement. They were obsessed with sanitary science. It was during this time that the Great Stink of London led to the construction of massive cathedral-like sewer systems that still function today. They began to understand that the health of the individual was linked to the health of the city. They became a people obsessed with fresh air. If you visit a Victorian seaside town today, you will still see the long piers stretching out into the ocean. These weren't just for entertainment. They were built so that people could walk far out over the crashing waves and breathe in the ozone, which they believed was a vital tonic for the lungs. The image of the Victorian invalid, reclining on a sofa in a darkened room, is a powerful one. We often assume this was a sign of a sickly, frail population. But for many, the rest cure was a deliberate choice in a world that was becoming increasingly frantic. They recognized the toll that stress and brain work took on the human spirit. They didn't have a word for burnout, but they understood the symptoms perfectly. To be an invalid was often a way to claim a necessary silence, to retreat from the pressures of society and the rigid expectations of the day. It was a form of self-care, albeit a heavily structured one. As we listen to the wind outside, let us reconsider the Victorian doctor. He is often portrayed as a grim figure in a black frock coat, more interested in amputation than healing. But this was the century that gave us anesthesia. Before the 1840s, surgery was a nightmare of speed and pain. But with the discovery of ether and chloroform, the entire experience of the human body changed. For the first time in history, pain was no longer an inevitable part of being healed. Queen Victoria herself helped remove the social stigma of anesthesia when she used it during the birth of her 8th child, calling it that blessed chloroform. This shift didn't just change medicine, it changed the human psyche. It introduced the idea that suffering was something that could and should be managed. And what of their hygiene? We are told they rarely bathed and that the cities were unbearable. While the lack of indoor plumbing for the working classes was a harsh reality, the Victorian obsession with cleanliness was legendary. The middle and upper classes were intensely focused on the sponge bath. Every morning, a pitcher of water, often ice cold to invigorate the system, was brought to the bedroom. They scrubbed themselves with coarse flannels and carbolic soap. They believed that a clean skin was a sign of a clean soul. The white-tiled look we associate with modern bathrooms was a Victorian invention, designed to show every speck of dirt so it could be ruthlessly eliminated. They were the ones who popularized the daily change of underclothes and the boiling of linens. They were fighting a war against the grime of the coal-burning world, and they fought it with a ferocity that bordered on the religious. In the quiet corners of the Victorian mind, there was also a fascinating relationship with the unseen. This was the era where psychology began to take root. They were fascinated by dreams, by the subconscious, and by the strange ways the mind could influence the body. They sought out hydropathy, the water cure, where they would travel to spas in the mountains to be wrapped in wet sheets and bathed in spring water. To us, it sounds like a strange folk remedy, but to them, it was a way to reconnect with the elemental world. It was a recognition that health was not just the absence of disease, but a state of balance between the physical and the spiritual. Think of the Victorian pharmacy or the apothecary. It was a place of beautiful blue and amber glass bottles, filled with exotic powders and tinctures. While some of their medicines were indeed dangerous, laudanum being the most famous, they were also the first to begin standardizing doses and testing the efficacy of drugs. They were moving, slowly and thoughtfully, from the world of magic into the world of science. They were explorers of the human interior, just as they were explorers of the distant corners of the globe. As the candle on the table flickers, casting a warm light on the pages of an old book, we can feel the deep humanity in their struggle for health. They didn't have the answers we have today, but they had an incredible resilience. They faced life-threatening illnesses with a quiet dignity and a belief in the power of fortitude. They cherished their walks in the park, their tonics of iron and wine, and the comfort of a well-made bed. They understood that the body was a temple, even if they were still learning how to tend to its foundations. The world outside remains dark, and the rain has turned into a soft, rhythmic mist. We are beginning to see that the Victorian era was not a time of stagnant decay, but a period of intense, almost frantic growth in our understanding of what it means to be well. They were the ones who gave us the hospital nurse as a figure of mercy, the public park as a place of healing, and the idea that even the poorest citizen deserved clean water and fresh air. As we prepare to move deeper into their world, let us carry this image of the Victorian, not as a victim of their time, but as a person who valued every breath, who sought beauty in the face of hardship, and who laid the groundwork for the comforts we take for granted today. There is a peace in their pragmatism, a comfort in their care. And as we sit here together, the distance between their century and ours feels a little smaller, the air a little clearer. The story of their lives continues to unfold, moving from the way they treated their bodies to the way they spent their most private moments. Behind the heavy oak doors and the lace curtains, there are more truths to find, more misconceptions to leave behind in the shadows. The mist outside the window thickens, wrapping the world in a soft white blanket that mirrors the privacy of the Victorian home. We have explored the vibrance of their surroundings and the resilience of their bodies. But now we turn our gaze toward the most misunderstood landscape of all, the Victorian heart. There is a persistent image of this era as a time of cold clinical marriages and a total absence of passion. A world where every emotion was buttoned up as tightly as a silk waistcoat, and where the mere mention of affection was considered a scandal. We imagine a people who were terrified of intimacy, living in a state of perpetual embarrassment. But if we listen closely to the rustle of stationery and the quiet whispers in the conservatory, we find a very different reality. The Victorians were not a cold people. They were, in fact, perhaps the most romantic generation to ever live. They were a people who felt so deeply that they had to invent entire secret languages just to express the magnitude of their emotions. Think of the way they approached courtship. We often see it as a rigid, joyless process overseen by stern chaperones, a series of hurdles designed to keep people apart. But for the Victorians, this was the great drama of life. Because social rules were so clearly defined, every small gesture took on a monumental significance. A glance held for a second too long, the way a flower was positioned in a lapel, or the specific angle at which a lady held her fan. These were not signs of repression, but a high-stakes language of desire. They lived in a world of subtext. While we today might be blunt and direct, the Victorians understood the exquisite tension of the slow burn. To them, the anticipation was part of the pleasure. They turned romance into a fine art, where the heart was a prize to be won through wit, character, and a shared understanding of silent signals. Consider the myth of the modest Victorian, who couldn't bear the sight of a piano leg. This is one of the most famous stories of the era, that they were so prudish they covered the limbs of their furniture with little trousers. In truth, this was a joke even at the time. It originated largely as a piece of satire meant to poke fun at the very few people who actually were that extreme. The vast majority of Victorians would have found the idea as ridiculous as we do. They were a people who appreciated the human form. They filled their homes with classical statues and their galleries with art that celebrated the body. They were not afraid of the physical world. They simply believed that there was a time and a place for everything. They valued the boundary between the public and the private, believing that what happened behind the heavy oak doors of a home was sacred and belonged only to those within. Behind those doors, we find letters. Thousands upon thousands of letters. Because there were no telephones and the postal service was incredibly efficient, often delivering mail several times a day in the city, the Victorians wrote to each other with a frequency and an intensity that we can hardly imagine. In these pages, the stiff Victorian vanishes. We find men writing poems to their wives that are filled with an almost desperate longing. We find women expressing a fierce intellectual companionability with their partners. They didn't just want a spouse, they wanted a soulmate, a term that gained immense popularity during this time. The rise of the love match was a Victorian triumph. While earlier generations often viewed marriage as a strategic alliance of land and title, the Victorians championed the idea that a marriage should be built on a foundation of mutual affection and respect. They were the ones who popularized the white wedding dress and the elaborate cake, turning the ceremony into a celebration of a personal, emotional bond rather than a business transaction. As the fire in our imagined room settles into a deep, pulsing red, think of the secret language of flowers, floriography. In an age where you could not always say, "I love you," in a crowded room, you could say it with a bouquet. Every blossom had a meaning, a specific word in the dictionary of the heart. A red rose spoke of passion, yes, but a sprig of gorse meant enduring affection, and a striped carnation was a gentle way of saying, "I cannot be with you." Imagine a young woman receiving a small, tussy-mussy bouquet and spending hours deciphering the hidden message tucked within the petals. This wasn't a society hiding from emotion. It was a society so saturated with it that they saw it reflected in the very grass beneath their feet. Even the way a postage stamp was tilted on an envelope could signal a secret message. A stamp placed upside down meant, "I love you," while one placed sideways meant, "I long for your reply." They turned the mundane world into a canvas for their feelings. This romantic intensity extended into their grief as well. We often look at Victorian mourning rituals, the black veils, the jet jewelry, the year-long periods of seclusion, and see it as something morbid or obsessive. But to the Victorian, this was the ultimate expression of love. They believed that if you loved someone deeply, your life should be visibly altered by their absence. Mourning wasn't about a fascination with death. It was about a reverence for the life that had been lost. They wore their hearts on their sleeves, literally, in the form of black crepe. It was a way of telling the community, "I have loved greatly, and I am hurting." In a world where life could be fragile, they refused to let their loved ones slip away unremembered. They kept locks of hair in golden lockets and commissioned portraits that captured a person's likeness one last time. It was a culture of deep, enduring memory. Even their sense of humor was deeply intertwined with their relationships. They loved to tease. They loved valentines that were sometimes beautiful and sometimes hilariously vinegarish and insulting, sent as jokes between friends. They were a people of great warmth, finding joy in long walks through the countryside and evenings spent reading aloud to one another by the light of a single lamp. This shared intellectual life was a cornerstone of Victorian romance. They valued conversation as the highest form of intimacy. To sit with a loved one and discuss a new scientific discovery or a serialized novel was, to them, a deeply romantic act. They were building lives that were woven together by threads of shared thought and mutual growth. As we linger in this space of the heart, the sepia version of the Victorian era continues to dissolve. We see instead a world of vibrant, pulsing emotion, of people who were navigating the complexities of love with a profound sense of wonder. They weren't repressed, they were focused. They understood that, by containing a fire, you make it burn hotter. Their rules and their proper exteriors were the fireplace that held the flame of their passion, keeping it safe and making it a source of warmth for their entire lives. They found beauty in the small things, the touch of a hand, the gift of a pressed leaf, the silent understanding across a dinner table. The house around us is quiet now, the only sound the soft sigh of the wind in the chimney. We have moved from the colours of their homes to the health of their bodies, and now through the secret corridors of their hearts. Each step takes us further away from the myths and closer to the truth of a people who were remarkably like us, searching for connection in a world that never stopped turning. There is a gentleness in their romanticism, a reminder that even in an age of steam and iron, the human spirit remains soft and seeking. The night is deep, and there is still so much more to discover about how these people lived when the sun rose. We have seen their private affections, but what of their public lives? How did they spend those long, lingering afternoons? What did they do for fun in a world without electricity? And how did they find wonder in the everyday? The answers lie in the way they played, the way they traveled, and the way they looked at the stars. The fire continues to pulse with a low, steady heat, a comforting rhythm in the silence of our imagined room. We have seen the Victorians in their homes, in their sickness, and in their deepest affections. But there is a persistent myth that their lives were entirely consumed by two things: grueling work and somber prayer. We imagine a society that had forgotten how to play, a people who saw any form of idle fun as a moral failing. We picture them walking in stiff lines through grey streets, their only recreation being a stern sermon on a Sunday morning. But as we step outside the parlour and into the wider world of the 19th century, we find a culture that was, in reality, obsessed with the idea of wonder. The Victorians didn't just have fun, they invented the very concept of the modern hobby and the weekend. They were a people who looked at a world being transformed by steam and iron, and decided that they needed to find the magic hidden in the cracks of the new industrial pavement. Close your eyes and listen for a sound that defines the Victorian summer. Not the roar of a factory, but the rhythmic, crashing sigh of the ocean. Before this era, the seaside was a place for fishermen and sailors, a rugged edge of the world that most people never saw. But the Victorians, with their brand new railways, changed that forever. They didn't just visit the beach, they fell in love with it. There is a common story that they were so modest that they used bathing machines, those small wooden huts on wheels, purely to hide their bodies from the scandalous sight of the open air. While there was a desire for privacy, the bathing machine was also a piece of theatre, a ritual of the holiday. Imagine the sound of the wheels crunching over the pebbles as a horse pulls your little wooden sanctuary into the surf. You step out directly into the cold, invigorating salt water, shielded from the wind. This was the water cure for the soul. They ate cockles and gingerbread on the sand, watched puppet shows, and for the first time in history, the working man and the factory girl could breathe air that didn't smell of coal smoke. They were the ones who turned the seaside into a place of joy, laughter, and wide-open horizons. When they weren't at the sea, they brought the sea and the forest into their homes. This leads us to one of the most delightful and quietest obsessions of the era, pteridomania, or fern fever. It is a myth that Victorian decor was merely a collection of dusty ornaments. In truth, many homes were living laboratories. Because the air in the cities was often heavy with soot, the Victorians invented the Wardian case, the ancestor of our modern terrarium. These were beautiful glass and iron miniature cathedrals filled with lush green ferns. To a Victorian, a fern wasn't just a plant. It was a miracle of geometry and ancient life. They would spend hours in the countryside fern hunting, bringing home specimens to nurture under glass. They found a profound, meditative peace in the slow unfurling of a new frond. They also created the first home aquariums, marveling at the silent world of goldfish and anemones. They were a generation of amateur naturalists, finding a deep, relaxing satisfaction in the minute details of the natural world. They understood that to look closely at a single leaf or a small shell was a way to quiet the mind in a loud century. This curiosity about the world often tipped over into a fascination with the unseen. We have been told that the Victorians were a people of hard, cold facts, but they were equally captivated by the supernatural. This was the great age of spiritualism. While we might think of a séance as something frightening or dark, for many Victorians, it was a social event, a way to spend a rainy Tuesday evening with friends. Imagine a group of people sitting in a quiet room, the windows draped in velvet, holding hands around a table. They weren't necessarily looking for ghosts to haunt them. They were looking for a bridge to the infinite. In an age of rapid scientific discovery, where things like electricity and telegraphs seemed like magic, it didn't feel like a leap to believe that the human spirit might also have its own telegraph to the other side. It was a search for connection and a way to process the mysteries of life. Even the most famous scientists of the day were often found in darkened rooms, trying to measure the weight of a soul or the energy of a thought. They didn't see a conflict between science and wonder. They saw them as two sides of the same coin. As the evening light fades, think of the spectacles they loved. The Victorians were the first generation of the experience. Before the cinema, they had the panorama and the magic lantern. Imagine walking into a circular building where a massive 360-degree painting surrounded you, depicting the Swiss Alps or the ruins of ancient Egypt. With clever lighting and hidden fans to create a breeze, you would feel for a few moments as if you had been transported across the globe. The magic lantern shows were the Netflix of the parlor. Glass slides painted with exquisite detail, projected onto a sheet, telling stories of travel, comedy, or ghost tales. They loved to be dazzled. They loved the Great Exhibition of 1851, a massive palace of glass that held the wonders of the entire world under one roof. They would walk for miles through aisles of clockwork inventions, giant diamonds, and steam engines, their hearts racing with the sheer scale of human imagination. They were a people who dreamed big, and they found a deep, communal joy in being amazed together. Even their everyday games were designed to bring people together in a spirit of playful chaos. We think of them as stiff, but their parlor games were often rowdy and physical. There was Snapdragon, where you had to pluck raisins out of a bowl of burning brandy, a game of laughter and scorched fingers. There were elaborate games of charades and tableau vivant, where friends would dress up in costumes to recreate famous paintings, holding their breath and staying perfectly still while others guessed the scene. This was a world without screens, where entertainment was something you created with your own hands, your own voice, and your own friends. It was active, it was social, and it was filled with a sense of humor that was often self-deprecating and bright. This love of leisure was not a distraction from life. It was the point of it. The Victorians believed in rational recreation, the idea that how you spent your free time shaped your character. But rational didn't mean boring. It meant finding things that fed the soul. They joined choral societies and sang in massive thousand-voice choirs. They joined walking clubs and wandered through the Lake District, inspired by the poetry of Wordsworth. They looked through microscopes and saw a universe in a drop of pond water, and they looked through telescopes and saw the mountains on the moon. They were a people who refused to let the world become small. As we sit here in our quiet space, the image of the dour, joyless Victorian continues to melt away. We see instead a person who is eager to learn, hungry for beauty, and deeply appreciative of the enchanted nature of life. They were the ones who taught us how to take a holiday, how to keep a pet, and how to find wonder in the small green things that grow in the shadows. They understood that the mind needs to rest in order to dream, and that the heart needs to play in order to stay young. The fog of the 19th century is not a shroud, it is a curtain, and behind it, a great colourful party has been going on all along. The fire is a collection of glowing rubies now, and the house is truly still. We have travelled far today, through their streets, their clinics, their secret letters, and their summer gardens. We are beginning to see a people who were not so different from ourselves, struggling to find balance in a world that wouldn't stop changing. But there is one more area we must explore to truly understand them: the world of their work, and the truth about the dark satanic mills. We have seen their play, but how did they truly spend those hours of labour? And was it as grim as we have been told? Or were there, even there, flashes of a humanity that we have forgotten? The shadows dance on the wall, and the air is cool and peaceful. The story of the Victorian world is far from over, and the truths we have yet to uncover are perhaps the most surprising of all. They are the stories of the makers, the dreamers who built the world we walk in today, and the quiet dignity of those whose names were never written in the history books, but whose lives were just as full of light. The fire has burned down to a gentle, pulsing glow, and the room is filled with the soft blue light of the pre-dawn hour. Outside, the world is beginning to stir, not with the harsh alarm of a modern clock, but with the rhythmic clatter of boots on cobblestones and the distant, lonely whistle of a steam engine. We have spent much of our time in the parlours and the gardens, but to truly know the Victorians, we must step out into the light of their working day. There is a deeply ingrained myth that the 19th century was nothing but a nightmare of dark satanic mills, a time when every man, woman, and child was a faceless cog in a giant greasy machine, living a life of unremitting grey toil. We imagine a world without a single smile, where the soot was so thick it smothered the soul. But as the morning mist begins to lift, we see a much more intricate picture. We see a world that was certainly hard, yes, but also one filled with an incredible sense of pride, the birth of the modern career, and a people who were fiercely determined to improve their lot. Consider first the image of the factory. We are told that industrialization destroyed the human spirit, replacing the artisan with the machine. But for many Victorians, the factory was a source of immense national pride. They didn't see it as a prison. They saw it as a cathedral of progress. If you were to walk through a textile mill in Manchester or a steel foundry in Sheffield, you wouldn't just hear noise. You would feel the heartbeat of a new world. The men and women who worked there were often highly skilled, possessing a deep, intuitive knowledge of their machinery. They were the first generation of engineers, a word that carried a weight of respect and wonder. They saw themselves as the builders of the future, the ones who were making the fabrics that clothed the world and the rails that connected distant continents. There was a profound dignity in that labor, a sense of belonging to a great global movement. They formed clubs, they joined mechanics institutes, to learn science and mathematics after their shifts, and they debated the politics of the day with a passion that would put modern voters to shame. They were not victims of the machine, they were its masters. And what of the children? This is perhaps the most painful myth of the era, that the Victorians invented child labour as a way to exploit the weak. In truth, children had worked for thousands of years, in the fields and in the homes, as a simple necessity of survival. What the Victorians actually did was become the first society in human history to say that this was wrong. They were the ones who looked at the soot-covered chimney sweeps and the small hands in the cotton mills and decided, through a series of radical factory acts, to limit their hours and eventually move them into the classroom. It was a slow, difficult struggle, but it was a Victorian struggle. They were the ones who invented the concept of childhood as a protected space, a time for play and learning, rather than just preparation for labour. When we look at the archives, we find teachers and reformers working tirelessly in the ragged schools, providing bread and books to those who had nothing. They were a people waking up to a collective conscience, trying to fix the problems that their own rapid growth had created. If we move away from the smoke of the factories, we find the largest group of workers in the Victorian era, those in domestic service. There is a common belief, fueled by modern television, that life below stairs was a simple hierarchy of stiff-necked butlers and mistreated scullery maids. But for millions of young people, entering service was a path to a better life. It was a career with a clear ladder of promotion. A young girl from a poor rural village who started as a tweenie could, through hard work and intelligence, rise to become a housekeeper, a position of immense power and responsibility within a great estate. These workers weren't just servants. They were the managers of complex, multi-million-pound operations. They had their own social circles, their own traditions, and a fierce sense of professional identity. They lived in houses that were warmer and cleaner than the ones they had left behind, and they gained skills in literacy, accounting, and management that they would eventually take with them into their own businesses or families. It wasn't always easy, and the hours were long, but it was a world of order and aspiration. Think also of the new middle class, the clerks, the bookkeepers, and the shop assistants. This was the era that created the 9-to-5 life we recognize today. Imagine the morning commute, not in a car, but on a horse-drawn omnibus or a steam-powered underground train. These workers were the glue that held the empire together. They took an immense, quiet pride in their appearance. The polished shoes, the clean white collar, the neatly kept ledger. This was the self-help generation, inspired by the writings of Samuel Smiles, who believed that through industry, frugality, and perseverance, any man could rise. They filled the new suburbs, planting small gardens and joining local societies. They were the ones who created the demand for the novels of Dickens and the poems of Tennyson. They were the explorers of the everyday, finding meaning in a stable job and a comfortable home. We often imagine the Victorian class system as a set of iron bars that no one could ever cross. We see the aristocrat in his manor and the labourer in his hovel and assume they were different species. But the Victorian era was a time of unprecedented social mobility. The Great Exhibition showed that an apprentice could become an inventor, and an inventor could become a knight of the realm. The boundaries were blurring. Success was no longer just about who your father was. It was about what you could do. This was a society that worshipped character. If you were honest, hard-working, and well-spoken, doors would open for you that had been locked for centuries. They were obsessed with the idea of the gentleman, but they redefined it. To a Victorian, A gentleman wasn't just a man of title. He was a man who behaved with honor, regardless of his bank account. As the sun climbs higher in our imagined sky, look at the streets themselves. They are teeming with costermongers selling fruit, mudlarks searching the riverbanks for treasure, and knocker-uppers who walk the streets with long poles to tap on windows and wake workers for their shifts. There was a vibrant, chaotic economy of the street that we often forget. Every person had a trade, a way to contribute. They weren't just a mass of people. They were a collection of individuals with names, jokes, and stories. They took pride in the quality of their wares and the strength of their voices. Even the most difficult jobs were often viewed through a lens of fortitude. The miners who worked deep underground, the sailors who braved the Atlantic in wooden ships, the seamstresses who worked by candlelight, they were all part of a culture that valued endurance. They didn't have a safety net as we know it, so they built their own. They created friendly societies and mutual aid groups, where members would pay a few pennies a week to ensure that if someone fell ill or died, their family would be cared for. This wasn't a cold, uncaring world. It was a world where people looked out for one another because they knew that their survival depended on it. They were the architects of the modern community. As we breathe in the crisp morning air of this past world, the grey of the Victorian working day begins to take on a golden hue. We see the sweat and the toil, yes, but we also see the satisfaction of a job well done. We see the hands that carved the intricate woodwork of the Parliament buildings, the minds that calculated the stresses of the Great Western Railway, and the voices that sang in the factory choirs. They were a people who found a strange, rugged beauty in their work. They believed that labour was a form of worship, a way to participate in the ongoing creation of the world. The city is fully awake now. The shops are opening their shutters, the horses are straining at their harnesses, and the air is filled with the smell of roasting coffee and coal smoke. We have moved from the quiet of the night into the roar of the day, and we have found that the facts of Victorian misery are only half the story. The other half is a story of ambition, of craftsmanship, and of a relentless, stubborn hope. They were building a world for us, even if they didn't know it yet. Every bridge they built, every law they passed to protect a worker, and every book they wrote to educate a child was a stone in the foundation of our modern lives. There is a peace in this realization, a sense of gratitude for those who came before us. They faced the challenges of a new age with a courage that we can still learn from today. But as the day progresses, we must look beyond the work and the class system. We must look at the food they ate, the things they bought, and the way they transformed the very act of consuming into something entirely new. The Victorian marketplace was a world of its own, a place of hidden dangers and incredible delights. The morning light is bright and clear, and the story of the Victorian world continues to flow forward like a river. There are more myths to gently set aside, more truths to discover in the bustle of the market and the quiet of the kitchen. The morning light now spills across the kitchen table, illuminating the fine dust motes dancing in the air. We have seen the Victorian at work and at play, but now we must look at what sustained them, the food they ate, and the way they transformed the simple act of shopping into a grand theatrical experience. There is a persistent myth that the Victorian diet was a dreary, grey affair of overcooked vegetables, gristly mutton, and heavy leaden puddings. We imagine a world without flavour, where the only spice was a bit of salt, and where the food was as stiff and formal as the people. But as we step into the heat of a 19th century kitchen, we find a world of surprising complexity, global influences, and a deep, sensual appreciation for the harvest. Close your eyes and breathe in the sense of a Victorian pantry. It is not a place of blandness. Instead, it is a treasure chest of the empire. Because of the vast trade network stretching across the globe, the average Victorian kitchen was far more international than we often realize. You would find jars of pungent turmeric and cumin from India, sticks of sweet cinnamon from Ceylon, and heavy pods of vanilla. They didn't just boil their food, they loved bold, aggressive flavors. They were obsessed with sauces, rich, dark gravies thickened with marrow, or sharp vinegary ketchups, made not just from tomatoes, but from mushrooms, walnuts, and even oysters. This was the era that gave us the curry, which became a staple of the British middle-class diet long before it was considered a modern takeaway. They found a deep, warming comfort in these spices, using them to transform humble ingredients into something exotic and memorable. Consider the myth of the poisoned Victorian food. We have all heard the stories of bread whitened with alum and chalk, or sweets coloured with lead-based paints. While these dangers were a reality in the early, unregulated years of the industrial city, the Victorians were the first to stand up and demand a change. They were a people obsessed with purity. They didn't just accept the adulteration of their food, they fought a war against it. It was during this time that the first analytical chemists began testing milk for water and flour for dust. They passed the landmark Sale of Food and Drugs Act, creating a world where, for the first time in history, a consumer had a legal right to know exactly what they were putting into their bodies. They invented the modern brand as a mark of trust. If you bought a tin of Coleman's mustard or a jar of Cross and Blackwell jam, you knew it was safe. This wasn't a society of victims. It was a society of empowered buyers who forced the industry to become honest. As we move from the pantry to the dining room, think of the ritual of tea. We often see it as a delicate, pinky-up affair for the wealthy. But for the Victorian, tea was the great equalizer. It was a moment of profound, quiet relaxation that bridged every class. For the factory worker, a high tea of strong dark leaves with a bit of bread and cheese was a necessary fortification against a long shift. For the middle class, the afternoon tea was a way to slow down the clock, to sit in the soft light of the late afternoon and connect with family. They didn't just drink tea, they worshipped it. They built elaborate silver services, knitted tea cozies to keep the pots warm, and created a culture of hospitality that was built around the warmth of the hearth. It was a meditative act, a way to find a hush in the middle of a noisy century. And what of the dark and dingy shops of the past? We imagine a world of small, cramped grocers where you had to haggle for every penny. But the Victorians were the ones who invented the palace of consumption, the department store. Imagine walking through the doors of a place like Harrods or Whiteley's for the first time. You wouldn't find a dark corner. You would find a cathedral of light. They used massive plates of glass, gleaming mahogany counters, and electric chandeliers to create a world of pure fantasy. For the Victorian woman, the department store was a revolutionary space. It was the first public area outside of the church or the home where she could walk freely and safely without a male chaperone. She could spend an entire day there, browsing the latest fashions from Paris, eating a light lunch in a rooftop garden, and writing letters in a dedicated reading room. It was a space of independence and luxury, a place where the everyday was elevated into something magnificent. They turned shopping into an art form, a way to dream about a better, more beautiful life. Consider the myth of the drunken Victorian, perpetually lost in a gin-soaked fog. While the gin palace was a reality of the early Victorian streets, with its etched glass and bright lights designed to lure people in from the cold, The era was also the birthplace of the temperance movement. They were a people who looked at the social cost of alcohol and decided to offer an alternative. This was the great age of soda water and lemonade. They invented the modern soft drink industry, creating beautiful, marble-topped temperance bars that served non-alcoholic tonics made from herbs and fruits. They saw sobriety not as a punishment, but as a way to reclaim one's dignity and health. They were the ones who popularized the idea of the coffee house as a place of intellectual exchange, a sober rival to the pub. They were constantly seeking ways to improve themselves, even in what they chose to pour into their glasses. Listen to the sound of a Victorian marketplace, the calls of the costermongers, the rattle of the delivery wagons, and the clink of coins on marble. They were the first generation to deal with the luxury of choice. Before this time, you ate what was grown in your village. But the Victorian could walk down a street in London or Birmingham and buy pineapples from the Azores, oranges from Spain, and beef from the plains of Argentina. They were the pioneers of the global supermarket. They marveled at the refrigerated ship, a technological miracle that allowed fresh food to travel across oceans. They didn't see this as a cold industrial process. They saw it as a way to bring the bounty of the earth to everyone's table. They were a people of immense curiosity, always willing to try a new fruit or a different way of preserving a vegetable. Even the way they cooked was a testament to their love of progress. The closed range, or the kitchener, was a Victorian masterpiece of iron and fire. It allowed a cook to control the heat with a precision that had been impossible with an open hearth. They invented the first mechanical whisks, the first reliable pressure cookers, and the first ice boxes that used blocks of frozen lake water to keep food fresh in the summer. They were a people who applied the same engineering brilliance to the kitchen as they did to the railway. They wanted their homes to be efficient, but they also wanted them to be places of abundance. The Mrs. Beeton image of the household, organized, orderly, and well-fed, was a Victorian ideal of a stable and happy society. As the sun begins to dip lower, casting a warm, honey-colored light across the polished wood of the dining table, we can see that the Victorian relationship with food was not one of dull necessity. It was a relationship of passion, innovation, and care. They understood that a meal was more than just calories. It was a way to show love, to celebrate a success, or to offer comfort in a time of grief. They brought the flavors of the world into their homes and turned the marketplace into a theater of wonder. They weren't afraid of the new, and they weren't content with the bland. The house is filling with the soft blue shadows of evening once again, and the smell of the morning's coffee has faded, replaced by the scent of a slow roasting dinner and the faint sweet aroma of a beeswax candle. We have traveled through their markets and their kitchens, finding a people who were as hungry for life as they were for the spices of the East. But there is one final myth we must address, one that touches on the very core of their identity. We have seen how they lived, but how did they deal with the great transition of life itself? We have been told they were obsessed with death, but perhaps they were actually obsessed with something else, the endurance of the soul. The story of the Victorian world is winding its way toward its conclusion, moving from the physical world of the marketplace to the spiritual world of the mind. There are truths yet to be found in the way they saw the stars and the way they prepared for the journey that follows this one. The afternoon sun begins to set, turning the sky into a deep, bruised purple that the Victorians would have called Tyrian. As the long shadows reach across the floorboards of our quiet room, we find ourselves at the edge of the most fascinating contradiction of the 19th century. We are told that this was an era of cold, hard rationalism, a time when the men of science in their white lab coats marched forward with a singular focus, stripping the world of its magic and replacing it with the cold iron of logic. We imagine a sharp line between the laboratory and the library, between the telescope and the temple. But as we sit here in the gathering twilight, we discover that the Victorian mind was actually a place where the physical and the metaphysical lived in a constant, beautiful, and sometimes chaotic embrace. They didn't see a wall between science and the supernatural. They saw a gateway. Consider the Victorian scientist. We see him as a figure of dry statistics, but in reality, he was an explorer of the unknown. When Charles Darwin published his thoughts on the origin of species, he wasn't trying to destroy the wonder of creation. He was trying to reveal its incredible, intricate clockwork. The Victorians were obsessed with natural theology, the idea that by studying the wing of a beetle or the strata of a cliffside, they were reading the very handwriting of the infinite. Every fossil found on a stormy beach was a message from a lost world, and every new element discovered in a chemist's retort was a piece of a cosmic puzzle. They were a people who looked at the world with wide, unblinking eyes, convinced that the more they understood the how of the universe, the more magnificent the why became. Yet, as they pushed the boundaries of the physical world, they found themselves increasingly drawn to the borders of the spiritual one. This leads us to one of the most misunderstood facts of the era: their obsession with spiritualism. We often look back at the seance table and the spirit photograph as a sign of a gullible people, easily tricked by shadows and magnets. But for the Victorian, spiritualism wasn't a rejection of science, it was an extension of it. Think of the inventions that were changing their lives every day. They had the telegraph, which allowed a message to travel instantly across thousands of miles through a hidden wire. They had the telephone, which let a voice be heard from a distant room. They had electricity, an invisible force that could illuminate a city. To a person living in 1870, if you could talk to someone in another city through a copper thread, why should it be impossible to talk to someone in another world through a medium? They applied the scientific method to the other side, forming the Society for Psychical Research to investigate hauntings and telepathy, with the same rigor they used to study steam pressure or infectious disease. This search for the unseen was a profound way of finding relaxation and meaning in a world that was becoming increasingly mechanical. While the factory roared outside, the séance room provided a space of absolute silence and focus. It was a shared experience of mystery. Imagine a group of friends sitting in the dark, the air thick with expectation. It wasn't about being frightened. It was about the comfort of knowing that the world was larger than what could be touched or weighed. They were a people who refused to let the soul be measured out in teaspoons. They wanted to believe that the human consciousness was a form of energy that, like the newly discovered laws of thermodynamics suggested, could never be truly destroyed, only transformed. As the stars begin to appear in our window, let us look at their fascination with the sky. The Victorians were the ones who truly brought astronomy into the home. Before this time, the stars were the domain of navigators and high priests. But the Victorian era saw a boom in the production of brass and glass, affordable, high-quality telescopes that could sit on a tripod in a garden or on a balcony. They would spend hours in the cold night air, mapped charts in hand, tracking the transit of Venus or the return of a comet. They found a deep, meditative peace in the scale of the universe. To look at the craters of the moon or the rings of Saturn was a way to put the anxieties of the city into perspective. They were the first generation to truly understand that they were living on a small, blue marble floating in a vast, silent ocean of stars. This didn't make them feel small. It made them feel part of something eternal. This love for the wondrous extended into the way they treated their own minds. This was the era that birthed modern psychology and the study of the subconscious. They were fascinated by hypnosis, or mesmerism, as it was often called. They believed that by putting a person into a deep, trance-like sleep, they could unlock the hidden rooms of the memory and heal the fractures of the spirit. They were the pioneers of the talking cure, recognizing for the first time that our thoughts and our dreams have a physical impact on our health. They were explorers of the inner landscape, mapping the geography of the human mind with the same courage they used to map the heart of Africa or the Arctic wastes. Consider also the myth that the Victorians were a people of cold religion, trapped in hollow rituals. While they were certainly a church-going people, their faith was often a deeply personal, questioning, and evolving thing. They were the ones who wrestled with the crisis of faith, trying to reconcile the old stories with the new discoveries of geology and biology. They didn't just give up. They leaned into the struggle. They wrote epic poems like Tennyson's In Memoriam, which spent 17 years exploring the nature of grief, doubt, and hope. They turned their churches into masterpieces of neo-Gothic architecture, filled with stained glass that told stories in light. They wanted their spiritual lives to be as beautiful and as complex as their scientific ones. As the moon rises, casting a silver glow over the silent house, we see the Victorian mind for what it truly was: a bridge. They stood between the ancient world of folklore and the modern world of the laboratory, and they refused to choose between them. They understood that the human spirit needs both the microscope and the dream, both the hard fact and the quiet prayer. They found a profound sense of rest in the idea that the universe was a place of endless secrets, waiting to be whispered to those who were willing to listen. The fire is nearly gone now, just a soft bed of white ash and a few stubborn sparks. We have traveled through the colors of their homes, the strength of their bodies, the secrets of their hearts, the joy of their play, the dignity of their work, the flavors of their tables, and now the vastness of their minds. Each myth we have set aside has revealed a person who was more vibrant, more curious, and more deeply human than we ever imagined. But our story has one final part. We must look at the way they saw the future, the world they thought they were building, and the legacy they left behind for us. We have looked back at them for so long. Now we must look at how they looked forward, and how their dreams of tomorrow shape the very air we breathe today. The night is quiet and still, and the journey through the 19th century is almost complete. There is a sense of closure in the air, a final gathering of truths before we return to our own time. The moon is high now, a silver disk hanging in the velvet sky of a world that was just beginning to imagine what lay beyond the clouds. We have journeyed through the parlors, the factories, the kitchens, and the séance rooms of the 19th century. But for our final movement, we must look at the Victorian gaze as it turned toward the horizon. There is a final, lingering myth we must address. The idea that the Victorians were a people looking backward, obsessed only with the past and trapped by tradition. We see their Gothic cathedrals and their love for medieval legends, and assume they were a people afraid of the future. But the truth is exactly the opposite. The Victorians were the first generation of futurists. They lived in a world where the impossible was becoming the everyday, and they spent their quietest hours dreaming of a tomorrow that was both terrifying and magnificent. Close your eyes and imagine a world where the air is filled with the hum of silent machinery and the sky is dotted with silver airships. This was the Victorian vision of the future. They didn't just build the world of steam, they were already dreaming of the world of electricity and beyond. Long before the first airplane took flight, Victorian illustrators were drawing aerial transit, imagining cities where people moved through the clouds in elegant gondolas suspended from balloons. They looked at the telegraph and imagined the telephonoscope, a device that would allow a person to see and speak to someone on the other side of the planet through a screen. They weren't just predicting technology, they were predicting the way it would change the human heart. They understood that a connected world would be a faster, smaller, a more intimate place. Consider the myth that they were anti-technology or Luddites at heart. While they certainly mourned the loss of the quiet countryside, they were deeply in love with the machine. They saw beauty in the rhythmic pulse of a piston and the intricate lacework of a steel bridge. They were the ones who turned the engineer into a hero, a figure who could conquer distance and gravity. They believed that, through invention, they could solve the ancient problems of humanity: hunger, disease, and poverty. They weren't just building railways, they were building a great peace. They believed that if people could travel and trade easily, the causes of war would simply evaporate. It was a time of immense, almost fragile optimism. They truly believed that they were the architects of a golden age that would last for 1,000 years. This optimism extended into their dreams of the city. We often think of the Victorian city as a place of decay, but their vision for the future city was a place of utopia. They imagined garden cities where every home had light and air, and where the factory was separated from the living room by belts of green forest. They were the ones who invented the concept of the skyscraper, dreaming of towers that would reach for the heavens. They were the first to imagine pneumatic tubes that would carry mail, and even people, through the streets at lightning speed. They saw the city not as a burden, but as a masterpiece of human organization. They wanted to create an environment that was as healthy as the countryside, but as vibrant as the marketplace. As the night air grows cooler, think of their lost inventions, the things they dreamed of that never quite came to be. They imagined mechanical teachers that would download knowledge directly into the minds of children, and automated kitchens where a meal could be prepared at the touch of a button. They even dreamed of weather control, imagining a world where the fog of London could be swept away by giant fans, or where the rain could be summoned to the fields during a drought. These weren't just idle fantasies. They were reflections of a people who believed that there was no limit to what the human mind could achieve. They looked at the world as a rough draft that they were destined to refine and perfect. Yet, within this love for the future, there was a profound sense of legacy. The Victorians were obsessed with time, not just their own time, but deep time. They were the ones who truly discovered the age of the earth and the vast stretches of prehistory. This discovery didn't make them feel insignificant. It made them feel like the guardians of a long and precious story. They built for the ages. When they laid the foundation of a bridge or a museum, they weren't thinking of the next 5 years. They were thinking of the next 500. They used materials like granite and cast iron because they wanted their work to endure. They were the generation that invented conservation, creating the first societies to protect ancient buildings and the first national trusts to save the wild places of the world. They understood that the future they were building needed to be rooted in a past that was respected and preserved. This is the true legacy of the Victorian era, the belief that progress and preservation could walk hand in hand. We are living in the future, they imagined. When we step onto a train, when we use a telephone, when we walk through a public park, or when we visit a library, we are walking through the dreams of a 19th century person. The facts we got wrong about them, the idea that they were cold or repressed or miserable, were often just a projection of our own modern anxieties. By stripping away those myths, we find a people who were remarkably brave. They stood at the edge of the modern world, and, instead of turning back in fear, they stepped forward with a sense of wonder and a commitment to hard work. The fire in our room has finally turned to a soft white ash, and the first light of a real dawn is beginning to touch the horizon. Our journey through the Victorian world is coming to a close. We have seen the vibrant colours behind the grey photographs, the laughter behind the stiff collars, and the passion beneath the lace curtains. We have found a world of spice, of science, of play, and of a relentless, stubborn hope. The Victorians were not a different species of human. They were simply our ancestors, dealing with a changing world with the tools and the wisdom they had at hand. As you move back into the bustle of your own century, carry a piece of their quietude with you. Remember the Victorian who found a universe in a fern leaf, or the clerk who took pride in the neatness of his ledger, or the family that found a world of joy in a simple game of charades by the fire. They taught us that even in an age of machines, the human spirit remains the most powerful force on earth. They taught us that beauty is a necessity, that connection is a sacred duty, and that the future is something we build with our own hands, one brick and one dream at a time. The mist is lifting from the streets of our imagined London, and the clatter of the horses is fading into the distance. The ticking of the grandfather clock remains, a steady, rhythmic pulse that connects their time to ours. The past is never truly gone. It is a foundation, a well of stories, and a source of comfort for those who take the time to listen. The Victorian era, once a place of shadows and myths, is now a place of light and clarity. The morning light brightens, but let us draw the heavy velvet curtains once more to return to a state of gentle focus. While the sun rises on the Victorian streets, there is a whole world within their homes and cities that we have fundamentally misunderstood. We often picture the Victorian era as a time of extreme physical discomfort, a world of stiff wooden chairs, drafty rooms, and clothing designed to restrict the human spirit. We imagine them as a people who sacrificed every ounce of ease for the sake of appearance. But as we settle into this quiet space, we must challenge the myth of Victorian discomfort. They were, in truth, the inventors of modern luxury and the pioneers of ergonomic living. They were a people obsessed with the science of comfort, and they spent their lives finding new ways to cradle the human body and soothe the human senses. Think first of the furniture. We look at the high-backed chairs and formal parlors and assume they spent their lives sitting perfectly upright, never daring to lounge. This is one of the most persistent misconceptions of the era. The Victorians actually revolutionized the way we sit. Before this time, furniture was largely made of wood with thin, flat cushions. But the Victorians mastered the art of the coil spring. They created the overstuffed armchair and the Chesterfield sofa, massive, deep, padded landscapes of leather and velvet that were designed for long hours of reading and conversation. They invented the spoon-back chair, which curved to follow the natural line of the spine. They were a people who loved to nest. If you were to walk into a private Victorian study, you wouldn't see a stiff museum. You would see a room designed for the ultimate retreat, with footstools, headrests, and fireside chairs specifically angled to catch the maximum warmth without the glare of the flames. They understood that the world was hard, and so they made their homes soft. This obsession with comfort extended to the very air they breathed inside their homes. We imagine Victorian houses as freezing, damp, and dark. While this was a reality for the very poor, the middle and upper classes were living through a revolution in heating and light. This was the age of the gaslight. Imagine the transition from the flickering, smoky light of a tallow candle to the steady, bright glow of gaslight. It transformed the evening. It meant that a family could sit together and read, sew, or play games well into the night without straining their eyes. They invented early forms of central heating, using intricate systems of pipes to carry steam or hot water through the walls. They were the ones who popularized the upholstered door, covering doors in fabric to dampen sound and block drafts. They treated their homes like living organisms that needed to be kept warm, quiet, and bright. They weren't suffering. They were luxuriating in the first wave of modern domestic technology. Consider the myth of the unwearable Victorian clothing. We see the layers of wool, the stiff collars, and the heavy skirts, and we wonder how they ever moved. But we forget that the Victorian world was not climate controlled. Those layers were a sophisticated system of temperature regulation. A man's wool suit was breathable in the summer and insulating in the winter. A woman's multiple petticoats acted as a buffer against the damp cold of a world heated only by coal fires. They were masters of fabric. They used silks that felt like water against the skin and linens that grew softer with every wash. Their clothing was almost always tailor-made to their specific measurements, meaning it fit with a precision that our modern off-the-rack clothing rarely achieves. A well-made Victorian frock coat or gown moved with the body, supporting the posture and protecting the wearer from the elements. They didn't feel trapped by their clothes. They felt armored and prepared for the day. Even their relationship with the great outdoors was focused on comfort. We think of them as stiff hikers or rigid strollers, but the Victorians invented the picnic as we know it today. They didn't just sit on the damp grass. They brought folding chairs, elaborate hampers, rugs, and even portable stoves. They turned the wilderness into a drawing room. They were the ones who popularized the pleasure garden and the public park, places designed specifically for the comfort of the soul. They believed that every person, no matter their status, deserved a place to sit on a bench under a tree and watch the world go by. They were the architects of leisure, recognizing that the human mind needs beauty and rest as much as the body needs food and water. Listen to the hush of a Victorian library. This was perhaps the ultimate comfort zone of the 19th century. We imagine it as a place of stern study, but for the Victorian, it was a place of deep, psychological relaxation. They were the ones who pioneered the serialized novel, stories published in monthly installments that created a sense of community and shared anticipation. They would wait with bated breath for the next chapter of a Dickens or a Thackeray story, gathering around the lamp to read aloud. This wasn't a cold intellectual exercise, it was an emotional one. They found comfort in the voices of characters who felt like friends. They were a people who understood the power of escapism long before the word was invented. And what of the Victorian bathroom? We are told they were a dirty people who feared water. In reality, the late Victorian era was the golden age of the hydrotherapy room. If you were wealthy, your bathroom was a temple of porcelain, brass, and heated towel rails. They didn't just wash, they bathed as a ritual. They used scented oils, sea salts, and elaborate sponges. Even the middle classes, who might still rely on a hip bath by the fire, turned it into a moment of extreme luxury, with warm towels and specially made soaps scented with sandalwood or rose. They were obsessed with the invigorating power of water. believing that a good scrub was the best way to reset the mind after a stressful day in the city. As we look at the flickering shadows on the wall, we see a people who were deeply in tune with their physical needs. They didn't view comfort as a weakness. They viewed it as a mark of civilization. They were the ones who taught us that a home should be a haven, that a chair should support the body, and that a bath should be a sanctuary. They lived in a world of tactile richness, the feel of a heavy book, the warmth of a wool rug, the smoothness of a polished banister. They were a people who understood that life is made of small physical moments, and they did everything in their power to make those moments as pleasant as possible. The stiff Victorian is a caricature. The real Victorian was someone who knew exactly how to lounge in a velvet armchair with a glass of sherry and a good book, while a fire crackled in a grate designed by an engineer to throw the maximum amount of heat into the room. They were a people who valued coziness as a high virtue. They called it homeliness, a word that has changed meaning over time, but for them, it meant a space that was perfectly attuned to the human need for security and ease. The fire in our rooms settled into a steady, comforting rhythm. We have dismantled the myth of the uncomfortable Victorian, replacing it with a picture of a society that truly understood the art of living well. But as we move forward, we must look at another area where we have perhaps been too quick to judge them. We have seen their physical comfort, but what of their social stiffness? We have been told they were a people of walls. Walls between classes, walls between genders, and walls between the respectable and the outcast. But the truth of Victorian social life was far more fluid and far more surprising than the history books suggest. The house remains quiet, the mist outside still clinging to the window panes. We are moving deeper into the social fabric of the era, finding the threads of connection that bridged the gaps we were told were impassable. There is a peace in knowing that even in a world of rules, the human heart always finds a way to reach across the divide. The fire continues to murmur in the hearth, its gentle light playing across the spines of old books and the patterns of the wallpaper. As we sit here, we find ourselves contemplating the invisible lines that supposedly divided the Victorian world. There is a deeply held belief that 19th century society was a series of rigid, frozen layers, a pyramid where you were born into a station and stayed there, trapped by the stiffness of your speech, the cut of your coat, or the neighborhood of your birth. We imagine a world of cold glares and slammed doors, where the respectable lived in total isolation from the rough. But as the shadows lengthen, we begin to see that Victorian society was not a brick wall. It was a river, constantly moving, swirling, and overflowing its banks. It was an era of incredible social fluidity, where the hidden worlds of subcultures and the blurring of class lines created a vibrant, often chaotic human landscape. Think first of the great myth of class. We are told that a Victorian gentleman would never speak to a labourer, or that a middle-class family would live in terror of being tarnished by the lower orders. In reality, the Victorian city was a place of constant, intimate contact. Because there were no cars, and few truly segregated suburbs in the early part of the era, the rich and the poor lived in startling proximity. A grand townhouse might share a back alley with a teeming tenement. The gentleman walked the same pavements as the costermonger, and the lady of the house negotiated every day with the butcher, the baker, and the flower seller. They were a people who understood each other's codes far better than we realize. There was a shared language of the street, a complex system of nods, slang, and mutual recognition that allowed the city to function. Furthermore, the idea that one could never rise is a modern shadow cast backward. The Victorians were obsessed with the self-made man. This was the century where a penniless apprentice could, through a mixture of luck and relentless industry, end his life as a member of Parliament or a wealthy industrialist. They didn't just tolerate this mobility, they celebrated it. They believed in character above all else. If a man educated himself at a mechanics institute, adopted the clean habits of the middle class, and spoke with a certain gravity, the doors of society would begin to creak open. We see this in the massive boom of etiquette manuals sold at the time. These weren't books for the aristocracy to keep others out. They were toolkits for the ambitious to get in. They taught you how to dress, how to write a letter, and how to navigate a dinner party. To a Victorian, class was often a performance. And like any performance, it could be learned, practiced, and mastered. Beyond the visible layers of society, there was a world of subcultures that we are only now beginning to truly understand. We have been told that the Victorians were a monoculture, all striving for the same respectability. But look into the bohemian quarters of London, Paris, or New York. There, you would find a world of artists, writers, and free thinkers who rejected every rule of the era. They lived in shared lofts, wore exotic clothing inspired by the East, and spent their nights in smoke-filled cafes discussing radical politics and new forms of art. They were the hipsters of the 19th century, creating a space where the daughter of a duke might sit at the same table as a struggling poet from the docks. They were a people who found a profound, relaxing freedom in the margins, away from the watchful eyes of Mrs. Grundy, the fictional character who represented the era's strict moral judgment. Even within the most respectable homes, there were hidden channels of connection. Consider the relationship between the Victorian family and their servants. We often see this as a cold, professional distance. But in the quiet hours of the night, or during the long days of a childhood spent in the nursery, these lines blurred. For many Victorian children, the most important emotional bond in their lives was not with their distant formal parents, but with their nanny or the cook. These servants brought with them the folklore, the songs, and the common sense of the working class, weaving it into the very fabric of the upper-class mind. The ghost stories and fairy tales that we think of as Victorian classics were often the oral traditions of the countryside, brought into the nursery by a girl from a small village. The classes didn't just live side by side, they inhabited each other's imaginations. Listen to the distant, rhythmic sound of a street organ playing in the fog. This was the soundtrack of the informal Victorian world. The streets were filled with sub-economies that bypassed the grand shops. There were the patterers who sold sensationalist pamphlets, the Punch and Judy men who brought anarchic comedy to every corner, and the night walkers who preferred the silence of the city after the lamps were lit. There was a sense of belonging to the street that defied class. In the pub, or at the music hall, the boundaries of the day dissolved. The music hall was the great Victorian melting pot. Here, the clerk, the sailor, and the shopgirl sat together in the smoky gallery, singing the same choruses and laughing at the same bawdy jokes. It was a space of pure, democratic joy, where the stiff Victorian exterior was checked at the door in favour of a raucous communal warmth. We also got the myth of the isolated woman wrong. While the legal and social restrictions on women were real and often harsh, the Victorian woman was a master of the network. They created a hidden architecture of influence through visiting, charity work, and letter writing. A middle-class woman might spend her mornings in the poorest slums of the city, working with fallen women or organizing soup kitchens. In these spaces, she encountered realities that were supposedly hidden from her. She became a political force, a lobbyist for the vulnerable, and a bridge between the worlds of the powerful and the powerless. They weren't trapped in their parlors. They were often the most mobile and socially aware members of their community, moving between the grand hall and the humble cottage with a sense of purpose that defied the separate spheres we read about in textbooks. Think of the clubs and societies that flourished in every town. Whether it was a choral society, a bowling club, a friendly society, or a group of amateur fossil hunters, these organizations were the social media of the 1800s. They provided a space where a man was judged by his voice, his aim, or his knowledge rather than his bank balance. They were a people who understood the peace of a shared interest. They found a deep, meditative relaxation in belonging to a group that worked together toward a common, often beautifully useless goal. They were building the civil society that we still rely on today, proving that a community is made not of laws, but of the thousands of tiny, voluntary connections between individuals. As the embers in our fireplace crackle and shift, we see the Victorian era as a time of intense, often messy human interaction. It wasn't a world of silence and separation. It was a world of noise and mixing. The stiff collar was the costume, but the fluid heart was the reality. They were a people navigating the shock of the new, finding ways to talk to one another, to help one another, and to move through the world in ways that their parents could never have imagined. They were the ones who proved that no matter how many rules you write, the human spirit will always find a way to dance in the gaps. The Victorian fact we got wrong was the idea of their immobility. They were, in fact, the most mobile generation in history, not just in terms of trains and steamships, but in the way they moved through the social landscape. They were a people of possibility, looking at the person next to them, not as a rank or a file, but as a fellow traveller in a century that was changing every single hour. The house is very still now, the only sound the slow, heavy tick of the clock. We've explored the comfort of their homes and the fluidity of their streets. But there is another hidden truth we must uncover, one that takes us from the social world into the natural one. We have been told that the Victorians were the conquerors of nature, a people who saw the world as a resource to be plundered and paved over. But in the quiet of their conservatories and the beauty of their parks, we find a different story. We find a people who were, perhaps for the first time, falling deeply, desperately in love with the wild world they were so rapidly losing. The shadows are long and peaceful, and the story of the Victorian heart continues to unfold, moving from the city street to the green garden. There is a hush in the air as we prepare to look at their relationship with the earth, the animals, and the enchanted nature they sought to protect. The fire burns with a soft, steady rhythm, mirroring the quiet growth of the world outside the parlor window. As we sit in this sanctuary, we must turn our thoughts to a myth that has painted the Victorians as the cold-hearted architects of environmental destruction. We often imagine the 19th century as a time of unbridled industrial greed, a world where forests were leveled for timber, rivers were choked with chemicals, and animals were seen merely as food or as trophies to be stuffed and placed under glass domes. We see the soot on the buildings and the fur coats in the portraits and assume a total lack of empathy for the living world. But as we peel back the industrial label, we find that the Victorians were in fact the first generation of modern environmentalists. They were the ones who looked at the smoke and the steel and felt a profound, aching need to protect the wild. They didn't just conquer nature, they were the first to realize that without it, the human soul would wither. Think first of the Victorian relationship with animals. There is a common story that they were a cruel people who viewed animals only through the lens of utility. In truth, The Victorians were the ones who invented the concept of animal rights. In 1824, they founded the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, which eventually became the RSPCA under Queen Victoria's patronage. This was a radical shift in human consciousness. For the first time, people were being prosecuted for mistreating horses, dogs, and livestock. They began to see animals not as things, but as sentient beings capable of suffering. This wasn't just a legal change, it was an emotional one. This was the era that gave us Black Beauty, a novel written not for children, but as a plea for the compassionate treatment of working horses. It became one of the most influential books of the century, changing the way an entire nation looked at the creatures that pulled their carriages and ploughed their fields. Consider the myth of the stuffed animal culture. While taxidermy was certainly a popular Victorian hobby, it was born out of a desperate, almost obsessive love for the natural world in an age before high-quality colour photography or nature documentaries. To a Victorian, a bird under glass wasn't a trophy. It was a specimen that allowed them to study the incredible colours of a feather or the curve of a beak in a way that brought the miracle of creation into their home. But even as some were collecting specimens, others were fighting to save the living. It was Victorian women who led the Plumage League protests, fighting against the horrific trade in exotic feathers for hats. They were the ones who founded the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, turning the tide of fashion through sheer moral force. They saw the beauty of the bird in the sky as far more valuable than the bird on a bonnet. This love for the living world transformed the Victorian home into a domestic menagerie. We think of pets today as a modern luxury, but the Victorians were the ones who truly popularized the idea of the companion animal. They didn't just keep dogs for hunting or cats for mice, they kept them for friendship. Queen Victoria herself was famous for her devotion to her dogs, particularly her collies and pugs. This royal love for animals filtered down through every level of society. They were the ones who invented pet cemeteries, creating quiet, shaded gardens where a beloved companion could be remembered with dignity. They wrote poems for their dogs and painted portraits of their cats. They found in their pets a source of uncomplicated love, a way to find peace and emotional warmth in a world that was becoming increasingly complex and mechanical. Beyond the home, the Victorians were the pioneers of the green lung. As their cities grew, they realized that the human spirit needed the comfort of green. They didn't just build parks, they designed them as outdoor cathedrals. Imagine a Victorian park with its winding paths, its carefully curated flower beds, and its grand bandstands. This was nature refined. They believed that by walking among the trees, the working man could find a restoration of the soul. They were the ones who protected the ancient commons, like Epping Forest or Hampstead Heath, ensuring they would never be built upon. They understood that a city without a forest was a city without a heart. They were the first to sound the alarm about air pollution, forming societies to fight the smoke of the factories and dreaming of a day when the sky would be clear once again. Think of the fern craze or pteridumania we touched on before, but look at it through the lens of environmental wonder. The Victorians were the first to treat botany as a popular passion. Thousands of ordinary people, clerks, shopgirls and teachers, would spend their weekends in the countryside, not just to pick flowers, but to study them. They used the newly invented microscope to see the hidden geometry of a moss or the structure of a seed. This wasn't a cold scientific exercise. It was a way to find enchantment in the everyday. They saw the infinite in the infinitesimal. They were the ones who created the first nature trails and published field guides that allowed the average person to identify the trees and birds of their neighborhood. They were teaching themselves and their children that the natural world was a library of wonder that must be cherished and protected. There is also the myth that the Victorians were solely responsible for the extinction of species. While the expansion of the empire certainly took a toll on global wildlife, the Victorians were the ones who first identified the concept of extinction as a permanent loss. They were the first to mourn the dodo and the great auk. This realization led to the birth of the conservation movement. They founded the first wildlife preserves and passed the first laws to protect non-game animals. They were the ones who began to think about the balance of nature, a concept that is the foundation of our modern ecology. They were a people who, having seen the power of the machine to destroy, became intensely focused on the power of the heart to preserve. Even their industrial marvels were often inspired by nature. Joseph Paxton, the man who designed the Crystal Palace, modelled its revolutionary iron and glass structure on the Victoria Amazonica water lily, specifically the incredible strength of its ribbed leaves. They didn't see technology as the enemy of nature, but as a way to learn from it. They looked at the flight of the bird and the movement of the fish and saw the blueprints for their own inventions. They were biomimics long before the term existed. They felt a profound kinship with the earth, even as they were building the railways that spanned it. As we sit in the soft light of this imagined evening, we can feel the deep, protective love the Victorians held for the world around them. They were the ones who taught us that we are the stewards of the planet, not just its masters. They gave us the national park, the animal shelter, and the environmental protest. They found a profound, meditative peace in the wilderness of the garden and the silence of the woods. They understood that nature was the ultimate relaxant, a place where the noise of the 19th century could be silenced by the sound of the wind in the pines. The fact we got wrong was the idea of their detachment from nature. They were, in truth, more connected to the natural world than we often are today. They knew the names of the trees in their streets and the birds in their hedges. They felt the seasons in their bones. They were a people who reached out to the wild with both hands, trying to hold on to the beauty and the mystery of the earth in the face of a changing world. The fire is glowing with a deep, earthy warmth. We have seen their homes, their hearts, and their gardens. But there is one final area of Victorian life we must explore: the world of the mind and the spirit that exists when the sun goes down. We have seen their science and their séances, but what of their inner lives and the surprising truth about Victorian nightlife? We have been told they were a people who went to bed early and lived in fear of the dark. But as we prepare to look at the Victorian night, we find a world of shadows, secrets, and a strange nocturnal freedom. The house is wrapped in a heavy, peaceful silence. The story of the Victorian world is drawing us into the dark, finding the light that exists even when the lamps are low. The fire has settled into a soft, pulsing bed of embers, casting long, flickering shadows that dance across the ceiling like memories of a lost century. As we sit here in the deepening quiet, we must confront a myth that has shrouded the Victorian night in a veil of gloom and fear. We often imagine the 19th century night as a time of absolute darkness, a terrifying void where the only people out on the streets were criminals, ghosts, or the desperately poor. We see the Victorians as a people who shuttered their windows at sunset, huddled by a single candle, and lived in a state of constant nocturnal anxiety. But as we look closer at the hours of the moon, we find that the Victorians were actually the pioneers of the modern nightlife. They were the ones who conquered the dark, turning the night into a space of liberation, beauty, and a unique form of relaxation that the daylight could never offer. Think first of the great myth of total darkness. Before the Victorian era, the night was indeed a formidable barrier. But the 19th century saw the greatest revolution in human history since the discovery of fire, the invention of artificial light. First came gaslight, and then the brilliance of electricity. Imagine being a Victorian in the 1880s, standing on a street corner as the new arc lamps flickered to life. For the first time in the story of our species, the city did not disappear when the sun went down. It became a nocturnal fairyland. The Victorians didn't fear this new night. They were enchanted by it. They flocked to the illuminated gardens and the brightly lit shop windows. They turned the act of promenading after dark into a social ritual. To walk through a city like London, Paris, or New York under the soft golden glow of gaslight was a profound way to relax. The harsh edges of the industrial world were softened by the shadows, and the city felt, for a few hours, like a dream. This new light allowed for the birth of the modern evening out. We often think of the Victorians as a people who stayed home and read sermons. In reality, they were obsessed with the theatre, the opera, and the music hall. The Victorian night was a symphony of sound. They would spend hours in the velvet silence of a darkened auditorium, allowing themselves to be transported by the magic of the stage. This was their form of meditation. In a world where they were expected to be proper and productive all day, the theatre provided a necessary emotional release. They cried at melodramas, laughed at pantomimes, and marveled at the transformation scenes where clever stagecraft turned a winter forest into a summer palace. They understood that the human spirit needs the play of the night to balance the toil of the day. Consider also the myth of the repressed Victorian evening. We imagine their social gatherings as stiff, silent affairs. But the Victorian soirée, or at home, was a masterpiece of informal connection. Because the night provided a shield from the prying eyes of the street, the Victorian parlour became a space of incredible warmth. This was the time for music. Not the professional music of the concert hall, but domestic music. Almost every middle-class home had a piano, and the night was filled with the sound of voices joined in song. They sang ballads of lost loves, humorous comic songs, and stirring choruses. They found a deep, rhythmic peace in making music together. They didn't need a screen to entertain them. They had each other's voices and the soft light of the lamps to create a world where they truly belonged. Beyond the respectable parlour, there was the secret nightlife of the Victorian city, a world we often misunderstand as purely sordid. This was the era of the all-night coffee stall and the midnight walk. For the Victorian flaneur, the person who walked the city just to observe it, the night was a time of absolute freedom. Writers like Charles Dickens were famous nocturnal travellers, walking 15 or 20 miles through the streets in the dead of night. They found that the city had a different pulse after midnight. It was a time of hush, where the architecture spoke louder than the people. They found a profound, solitary relaxation in the vastness of the empty street. They weren't afraid. They were curious. They saw the night as a blank canvas, where they could process their thoughts and find inspiration in the silence. Think of the nocturnal science they loved. We have seen their telescopes, but the Victorian night was also the time for astrophotography, the first attempts to capture the image of a star on a silver plate. They would spend all night in cold observatories, waiting for the perfect alignment of the heavens. This wasn't work to them. It was a form of cosmic communion. They found a deep, humbling peace in the realization that while the world of men was loud and chaotic, the world of the stars was silent and eternal. They were a people who weren't afraid to look up into the dark, finding there not a void, but a universe of light. There is also the myth that the Victorians were a people of early to bed, early to rise. While the factory clock dictated the lives of many, for the growing middle and upper classes, the night was stretched. They invented the late dinner, often eating at 8 or 9 o'clock. This changed the entire tempo of the day. It meant that the evening was not just a prelude to sleep, but a destination in itself. They were the ones who created the supper club and the night cafe. They were a people who were beginning to live nocturnally, finding that the brain was often sharper and the heart more open after the sun had set. They were the first to experience the modern night, a time of choice, of culture, and of a shared glowing community. Even their morning rituals had a nocturnal beauty. We think of Victorian graveyards as spooky, dark places, But the Victorians designed their great cemeteries, like Highgate or Père Lachaise, as gardens of sleep. They would visit them in the late afternoon and early evening, finding a melancholy peace in the quiet paths and the weeping willows. They didn't see the night of death as something to be feared, but as a natural rest. They found a profound relaxation in the permanence of these places, a reminder that the rush of the 19th century was only a fleeting moment in the long silence of time. As the embers in our fireplace fade into a soft grey ash, we can feel the true spirit of the Victorian night. It wasn't a time of unreasoning fear, but a time of reasonable wonder. They were the ones who turned on the lights, but they were also the ones who understood the value of the shadows. They found peace in the glow of a lamp, the melody of a song, the silence of a street, and the distance of a star. They taught us that the night is not the enemy of the day, but its necessary shadow, a place where the soul can finally catch its breath. The fact we got wrong was the idea of their darkness. They were in truth a people of light, constantly seeking new ways to illuminate their world, their minds, and their hearts. They didn't cower in the dark. They invited it in, sat with it by the fire, and turned it into a source of inspiration and rest. The house is now wrapped in the absolute stillness of the hour before dawn. We have travelled through their homes, their streets, their gardens, and their nights. We have seen the human behind the myth in every part of our story. But there is one final, unspoken truth we must touch upon before we return to our own time. The truth about how the Victorians remembered and how they prepared to be remembered by us. The air in the room is cool and fresh, and the first ghostly light of the morning is beginning to touch the edges of the curtains. The journey is nearly complete. The first traces of the morning sun are beginning to touch the heavy fabric of the curtains. Yet in the heart of our quiet room, the shadows of the 19th century linger for one final contemplative moment. We have explored the textures of their lives, the warmth of their homes, and the vibrance of their cities. But we must now turn to a myth that concerns the very way the Victorians looked at themselves in the mirror of history. We often imagine them as a people obsessed with their own permanence, a society so convinced of its own greatness that they expected the world to stand still in admiration of their progress forever. We see their massive monuments and their grand histories and assume a lack of humility. But as we look closer at the quiet archives they left behind, we find a different truth. The Victorians were, in fact, the first generation to be deeply, beautifully nostalgic for the very world they were creating. They were a people who felt the slip of time more keenly than any who came before, and they spent their lives creating bridges to the future, to us. Think first of the great myth of Victorian arrogance. We are told they believed their era was the pinnacle of human achievement and that they looked back at the past with nothing but pity. In reality, the Victorians were deeply haunted by what they were losing. As the railways sliced through the countryside and the factories replaced the artisan's workshop, they felt a profound sense of cultural vertigo. They were the ones who invented the time capsule. They didn't just build, they buried. They placed coins, newspapers, and handwritten letters beneath the foundations of their bridges and town halls, specifically addressed to the citizens of the future. This wasn't a sign of ego. It was an act of profound, quiet communication. They wanted to be understood. They wanted us to know that beneath the soot and the steam, there were people who wondered about us, who worried about us, and who hoped that the world they were building would be a place of peace for our feet. Consider also the myth of the stagnant Victorian Museum. We see these grand buildings as cold vaults of the past, but for the Victorian, The museum was a living sanctuary of relaxation and memory. They were the ones who pioneered the idea of the public collection. They didn't just gather objects for scholars. They gathered them so that the factory worker on his day off could stand before a Greek statue or a medieval tapestry and feel the continuity of the human spirit. They found a deep, meditative rest in the long view of history. They were the first generation to experience historical tourism, traveling to ruins and ancient sites not to conquer them, but to sit among the stones and contemplate the passing of ages. They understood that to know where you are going, you must find a quiet place to remember where you have been. This love for memory transformed the way they treated their own personal lives. This was the era of the scrapbook and the commonplace book. We often think of these as mere hobbies, but they were the personal archives of a people who knew that the world was changing too fast to hold on to. A Victorian woman might spend her evenings pasting theatre tickets, pressed flowers, and snippets of poetry into a leather-bound volume. This was her way of slowing down the clock. It was a rhythmic, tactile form of relaxation, a way to turn the chaos of the everyday into an ordered garden of memories. They didn't have digital clouds to store their photos. They had the weight of the object, the scent of the paper, and the ink of the pen. They found a profound comfort in the solidity of their memories, a reminder that their lives had a shape and a meaning that would outlast the flickering gaslight. Think of the ghost of the past they invited into their literature. We have seen their love for the supernatural, but their ghost stories were often actually stories about nostalgia. When Charles Dickens wrote A Christmas Carol, he wasn't just writing a ghost story. He was writing a plea for the preservation of the heart. The Victorians were the ones who invented the modern Christmas, reaching back to an imagined old England of stagecoaches and Yule logs to find a sense of stability in a world of steam engines. They found a deep communal relaxation in these invented traditions. They realized that the faster the world moves, the more we need anchors, rituals of warmth, food, and family that remain unchanged year after year. They were building a home for the soul that we still inhabit every December. Consider also the myth of the cold Victorian funeral. We have seen their mourning clothes, but look at the message behind them. They were a people who refused to forget. They turned the act of remembering the dead into a lifelong commitment. This wasn't morbid. It was a way of honoring the endurance of love. They kept locks of hair, not as creepy relics, but as tangible connections to someone who was still part of their story. They found a quiet, somber peace in this continuance. They believed that as long as someone was remembered, they were never truly gone. This was their victory over time. They were teaching us that the most important thing we leave behind is not our inventions or our buildings, but the impression we leave on the hearts of others. Listen to the echo of their voices in the letters they left behind. The Victorians were the greatest letter writers in history. They didn't just exchange information, they shared their inner selves. In an age of fast travel, the letter was the bridge that kept families and lovers connected. They would wait for the postman with an intensity that we can hardly imagine. To sit and read a long, multi-page letter from a loved one was a form of deep listening. It was a way to be with someone across the miles. They found a profound, rhythmic relaxation in the slow conversation of the written word. They taught us that connection takes time, and that the best things in life are the ones we wait for with a quiet, patient heart. Even their scientific discoveries were often tinged with this sense of wonder and loss. When they looked at the bones of a dinosaur or the ruins of a lost civilization, they weren't just being clinical, They were feeling the sublimity of time. They found a restorative perspective in the realization that they were part of a vast, unfolding drama. They were the ones who gave us the word prehistoric, creating a space for the imagination to wander back through millions of years. They found peace in the bigness of the story, a reminder that their own worries and anxieties were part of a much larger, much more beautiful harmony. As the morning light finally begins to flood the room, we can see the Victorians for what they truly were, the guardians of memory. They weren't a people who got the facts wrong. They were a people who were trying to figure out which facts mattered. They chose to value character, comfort, connection, and continuity. They built for us, they wrote for us, and they dreamed of us. They were the ones who proved that no matter how much the world changes, the human need for belonging remains the same. The fact we got wrong was the idea of their disconnection from us. They were in truth more connected to the future than any generation before them. They lived with one eye on the clock and one eye on the horizon, always wondering how they would be judged by the unborn millions. They left us a world of clues in their parks, their books, their monuments, and their letters, inviting us to find the common humanity that binds us across the centuries. The fire is now a memory, and the room is bright with the clarity of the present day. We have travelled through the fog and the glow, finding the light of the Victorian world in every shadow. The journey is complete, and the rest is ours to keep. As you step out of this quiet space and back into your own life, remember the quiet Victorian who is still whispering to you through the stones of a bridge or the pages of a book. They are reminding you to slow down, to look closer, and to find the beauty in the changing world just as they did. The story of the 19th century is not a closed book. It is a living conversation, and in the hush of a quiet mind, you can still hear the rhythmic tick of their hearts, beating in time with your own. The sunlight is fully present now, painting the room in clear, sharp lines. But let us linger a while longer in the enchanted world of the Victorian imagination. We have explored their grand ideas and their vast cities, but there is a final, delicate myth to dismantle. The idea that the Victorians were a people of soulless materialism. We often look at their homes, filled to the brim with trinkets, ornaments, and heavy furniture, and we see nothing but a cluttered obsession with stuff. We imagine a society that valued an object only for its price or its display of wealth. But as we sit in the quiet of this morning, we find that to a Victorian, an object was never just an object. They lived in a world where everything, from a silver spoon to a simple piece of lace, was a vessel for a hidden language. They were a people who turned the material world into a landscape of symbols, using the things they touched and kept to create a life of deep, secret meanings. Think first of the great myth of Victorian clutter. We are told that their homes were a chaotic mess of useless things. In reality, every item in a Victorian room was part of a visual narrative. They were a people who believed in sentimental education. An ornament on a mantelpiece wasn't just decoration, it was a memory anchor. A porcelain shepherdess might represent a cherished childhood story. A specific shell might be a reminder of a restorative summer by the sea. A small brass clock might be a legacy from a grandfather's workshop. They found a profound, meditative peace in surrounding themselves with these bookmarks of life. They weren't hoarding things, they were weaving a story. They understood that the mind finds rest when it is surrounded by familiar friends, objects that speak of history, love, and continuity. This secret language was perhaps most beautiful in the world of Victorian jewellery. We often see their jewellery as heavy and over the top, but it was actually a sophisticated vocabulary of the heart. They used acrostic jewelry, where the first letter of each gemstone spelled out a secret word. A ring set with a diamond, an emerald, an amethyst, and a ruby wasn't just a display of wealth. It was the word dear, whispered in light against the skin. They wore misper rings to signal a shared bond between friends or lovers separated by distance, referencing a prayer for protection. They found a deep, rhythmic relaxation in these silent conversations. They could say, "I love you," "I remember," or "stay safe," without ever speaking a word. They turned the hard minerals of the earth into the softest expressions of human emotion. Consider also the myth of the merely decorative Victorian garden. We have seen their love for parks, but look at the hidden meanings they planted in their flower beds. We touched on the language of flowers, but the Victorians took this even further, creating memory gardens, where every plant was chosen for its symbolic connection to a person or an event. They planted rosemary for remembrance, pansies for thoughts, and oak trees for strength. They weren't just gardening, they were writing a poem in the soil. They found a profound, grounding peace in the knowledge that their garden was a living map of their inner world. To walk through their own gate was to step into a sanctuary where the very leaves whispered familiar names and old stories. They were the ones who taught us that the world is enchanted if only we have the key to its symbols. Think of the secret language of lace. To our modern eyes, Victorian lace is just a pretty fabric. But to the Victorian woman, the pattern of a lace collar or the weave of a veil could signal her status, her heritage, or even her mood. There were specific patterns for mourning, for weddings, and for quiet afternoons. The act of making lace, the repetitive rhythmic movement of the bobbins or the needle, was a form of manual meditation. Thousands of women found a deep, focused relaxation in the slow creation of these intricate webs. They were turning time into beauty. They understood that the value of an object lay in the hours of life that were woven into its very threads. A handmade lace handkerchief was a sacred gift, a piece of the maker's soul given to another. Listen to the clink of a silver tea service. We often see this as a symbol of snobbery. But for the Victorian, the ritual of the object was a way to order the chaos of the world. The specific weight of the teapot, the delicate sound of the china, and the warmth of the silver were sensory grounding techniques. They found that by performing a small, beautiful ritual with familiar objects, they could reset their nerves after a loud day. They were the pioneers of sensory comfort. They used scent bottles filled with lavender or rosewater, tactile velvet cushions, and visual puzzles to keep their minds engaged and calm. They were a people who understood that our environment shapes our internal state, and they used every tool at their disposal to make that state one of refined peace. Consider also the myth of the merely functional Victorian book. We have seen their libraries, but look at the physicality of the Victorian book itself. They were obsessed with fine binding, leather, gold leaf, and silk bookmarks. They didn't just read a book, they experienced it. They found a profound, tactile relaxation in the feel of a well-made volume. The act of cutting the pages of a new book with a silver paper knife was a ritual of anticipation, a way to slow down the act of consumption. They were the ones who taught us that a book is a sacred object, a portable sanctuary that we carry with us through the world. They found peace in the solidity of the word, a reminder that even in a world of steam and change, some things are written in gold. Even their scientific instruments were treated with this same aesthetic reverence. A Victorian microscope or telescope was a work of art, made of gleaming brass and polished mahogany. They didn't see beauty and utility as separate things. They believed that if an object was meant to reveal the wonders of the universe, it should be as beautiful as the universe itself. They found a spiritual rest in the craftsmanship of their tools. They understood that when we treat our objects with respect, we are ultimately treating ourselves and the world with respect. They were a people of quality, finding in the endurance of an object a reflection of the endurance of the human spirit. As the sun continues to rise, illuminating every corner of our room, we can see the Victorian world as a tapestry of meaning. They weren't materialists in the way we often use the word. They were meaning makers. They used the things of the earth to build cathedrals of memory and chapels of comfort in their own homes. They found peace in the secret language of gems, flowers, lace, and books. They taught us that the world is only empty if we forget how to look for the soul within the object. The fact we got wrong was the idea of their clutter. It wasn't clutter, it was company. It was a world of vibrant things that kept the heart warm and the mind focused. They were a people who walked through a forest of symbols, finding in every stone and every thread a reason to stay curious, stay connected, and stay at peace. The house is bright now, and the birds in the garden are singing with a renewed energy. We have traveled through the hidden language of their material world, finding the magic in the mundane. Only one part remains of our long journey, the final summing up of the Victorian spirit and the parting gift they left for us, the people of the future. The sun has now climbed high enough to fill every corner of our room with a clear, unwavering light. The long shadows of the 19th century have retreated into the corners, leaving us with a sense of profound clarity and a deep, rhythmic calm. We have spent this long journey deconstructing the myths that for so long made the Victorians seem like a different species, stiff, repressed, and perpetually somber. We have found instead a people of electric colour, fierce romance, rowdy humour, and a revolutionary commitment to comfort and the natural world. But as we prepare to close this book of the past and return to the hum of the 21st century, we must ask ourselves, what is the final fact we got wrong? Perhaps it is the idea that the Victorian era is truly over. As we look at the world around us, we find that we are still living in the legacy of light they created, and their greatest gift to us is not a piece of technology, but a philosophy of the soul for a fast-moving world. Think first of the great myth of Victorian irrelevance. We often look back at their era as a curious museum piece, a closed chapter that has nothing to say to our modern age of digital speed and global uncertainty. In reality, the Victorians were the first generation to face the modern crisis. They were the ones who first experienced the shaking of the foundations, the moment when science, industry, and global connection began to move faster than the human heart could easily follow. They didn't have the answers, but they had the courage of the question. They found that the only way to survive a century of change was to cultivate an inner stillness. They were the ones who taught us that when the world outside becomes a roar, the world inside must become a sanctuary. Consider the myth of the work-obsessed Victorian. We have seen their factories and their ledgers, but look at the counterculture of rest they created. The Victorians were the ones who understood that recreation is literally the act of recreating the self. They didn't see hobbies, gardens, or music as extras to be squeezed into the margins of life. They saw them as the essential armor of the spirit. They taught us that to be truly human, we must have useless passions, things we do simply because they bring us wonder, not because they bring us profit. They found a deep, meditative relaxation in the slow crafts, the knitting, the wood carving, the letter writing, reminding us that the hand and the heart must work together to find peace. This legacy lives on in our own search for mindfulness. The Victorians didn't use that word, but they lived the practice. When they sat for hours in a blind to watch a bird, or spent a whole evening reading a single poem aloud, they were practicing the art of deep attention. They were a people who refused to skim life. They understood that the more saturated our attention is, the more vibrant the world becomes. They found peace in the minute detail, the vein of a leaf, the texture of a stone, the specific inflection of a loved one's voice. They are whispering to us across the years, telling us to unplug, to look closer, and to find the infinity that exists in a single quiet moment of presence. Think also of the myth of Victorian insularity. We have seen their global trade, but look at their global heart. The Victorians were the ones who first began to think of themselves as citizens of the world. They were the first to feel a universal responsibility for the suffering of others and the protection of the earth. They taught us that connection is a moral force. They believed that by building bridges, both literal and emotional, we could create a commonwealth of the spirit. They found a profound, grounding relaxation in service, in the knowledge that they were part of something larger than their own small lives. They were the architects of the community, reminding us that we find our greatest rest when we find our place among others. As we stand at the threshold of our own time, let us look at the parting gift they left us, the beauty of the enduring. The Victorians were a people who built to last. They used stone, iron, and ink because they believed in the future. This belief is a form of optimism that we often lose in our age of the temporary and the disposable. They found a deep, quiet comfort in the solid. They taught us that by creating things of quality, whether it's a building, a friendship, or a memory, we are building a house that time cannot touch. They found peace in fortitude, a rugged, stubborn hope that no matter how dark the fog or how loud the engine, the human values of kindness, curiosity, and character would always prevail. Listen to the hush that has fallen over our imagined 19th century room. The fire is gone, the sun is high, and the air is clear. The Victorians have given us their stories, their secrets, and their hidden languages. They have invited us into their parlors and their hearts, showing us that the facts we got wrong were the very things that made them the most like us. They were a people of light in a world of shadow, just as we are. They were travelers on a changing river, just as we are. And they found their way home by following the stars of beauty, connection, and rest. The fact we got wrong was the idea that we are better or wiser than they were. We are simply their children, standing on the shoulders of their giants, breathing the air of the parks they planted, and reading the books they wrote by the light of the lamps they invented. They are not ghosts to be feared or caricatures to be mocked. They are mentors in the art of living deeply. They are the ones who proved that the history to relax is not a history of the dead, but a history of the alive, of a people who felt the sun on their faces and the love in their hearts with a fierce, quiet intensity. Take a final, deep breath. The journey through the Victorian era is complete. You are back in your own time, in your own space, but you carry with you the golden key to a century of wonder. The sepia has been washed away, and the world is in full color once again. The stiff has become supple, the cold has become warm, and the past has become a pathway. The clock in the hallway strikes the hour, a steady, familiar sound. The world of the 19th century is still there, just behind the curtain of the everyday, waiting to offer you its peace whenever the modern world becomes too loud. All you have to do is listen. All you have to do is remember. All you have to do is be still.